everyone. Today we are here to interview one of our esteemed guests, Miss Alice Hill, who has served an extravagant career as not only under the federal government, Barack Obama, but also as a active worker and advocate for resilience, and has authored a book which explains how resilience making can be incorporated in our policies and our day-to-day life so that we can be better prepared for future. Resilience in itself is a principle that is something that will prepare us for the worst that is yet to come in terms of global and climatic crisis. Today, we will be talking to her about what and how resilience can be applied to us on a global level as Indians and as youth. And we hope to have an insightful chat with you, ma'am.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
So, ma'am, the first question is that when one Googles resilience, or when one needs to talk about resilience, there's lots of literature to study from, and there's a lot of research that has gone into it, right? However, there are very few places where resilience planning is actually done. There is hardly any mainstreaming of policy. So, ma'am, how do we make this a principle that is not just in research, but also applied in day-to-day activities? How do we make transition research to implementation?
You've pointed out a really important problem. We all talk about resilience, but there isn't as much action, at least not for preparing for the future impacts of climate change as we would hope. I think the way to mainstream this has to be through planning. And the planning should come at the national level through national adaptation plans, and then through the subnational, through their implementation and local, municipal, city plans. The central requirement has to be that there is no investment made unless it's climate resilient. Certainly no investment made with public funds, taxpayer dollars, until there's an assurance that whatever is being built or organized will withstand the impacts that are expected over the life of that program or building, whatever it may be. For example, a bridge. You need to make sure that you've built a bridge that can withstand future flooding. If we don't, which we are currently, that's what we do now. We build bridges to historical, the kind of risk we've seen in the past. And if we do that, that will not leave us safe for the future. One of the most important things to recognize, but I think is one of the most difficult things for people to understand about climate change, is that the past is no longer a safe guide for the future. So we need to build resilience to those future events that we know are coming.
Right, so just as a follow-up to this, when you talked about putting it into action in terms of national action plans as well as some sort of national policies, do you think this can be taken up at an international scale? For example, we've seen how the Paris Accords went across in terms of getting the entire world to focus on climate change. And there have been multiple meetings at the UN itself talking about climate change. So do you think this is something that can be taken up at an international level?
Well, we've certainly seen more movement on the international level with the critical problem of cutting emissions. And the most resilient strategy of all is to cut emissions so we avoid the very worst of the heating. But now we have emitted enough globally that we will experience the impacts for at least the next several decades, and those impacts will get worse. There'll be more flooding, there'll be more extreme heat, we'll see bigger storms. So we need to plan for those. On the international level, we've had the Green Climate Fund. My country, I am not pleased to say, has not been active since we've had a change of administration. We've pulled out from the Paris Agreement, so I think that has undercut at least US presence in the international governance structure, and I'm afraid may have influenced other countries that they need not care as much. But of course, this is a global problem. It calls for global solutions. Resilience decisions, however, are made on the local level. Not every location in the world is going to suffer the same impacts. There will be global heating, but you'll see different communities suffering in different ways. And so those resilience decisions need to be made locally. To your issue of what we can do internationally, we have the Global Commission on Adaptation headed by Ban Ki-moon and Bill Gates. They've called for a revolution in understanding, a revolution in planning, and called for a number of measures, better early warning, better financing. All of that needs to be done to get us to a more resilient place going forward.
Right, and something that you touched upon in your answer to the follow-up itself was that with changing administration or changing political ideologies, we have seen a lot of polarization with respect to climate change itself. But something that's sort of taken the undercurrent is that there's been plenty of activism from the younger generation all over the world. Do you think does this make you hopeful that the future ahead will prove to be slightly different? Do you think the future taxpayers will be more accepting of government or administrations that take up environmental endeavors as well?
I hope so. I have been thrilled and energized to see the young people take on this issue. My generation has made it a political issue, a matter of belief, saying that climate science is somehow not something that we should follow. But the younger generation, I think, have indicated that they don't want to waste time on debating whether it's occurring. They want to figure out solutions for what to do about it. And that is the most important thing we can do. To see Greta organizing children not going to school, to see people out on the streets in the United States, the Sunrise Movement led by young people who are requiring greater accountability among financial institutions, all of that is a sign, in my opinion, that the younger generation get this. They know how important it is to act, and they're willing to do what it takes to help move the older generation to act or to vote them out of office so that somebody else will act.
Right. Ma'am, when we're also talking about a national policy or a national framework, one of the problems that India faces, that's rather a huge problem here, is the cultural hindrance, as in people not wanting to change the way they live or not wanting to become more resilient just because it does not align with their cultural beliefs or their cultural practices. For example, our pujas that we have, the festivals that we have are anything but resilient, and people are not willing to change that. So in such a scenario, what do you think we should do as the young generation? How can we persuade them to change their ways of living and to become more sensitive about the environment?
Well, I know here in the United States, one of the most important things that all of us can do, but young people in particular, is to talk about climate change. What we find is that during our big holidays, we celebrate as a family, typically Thanksgiving. That's our national day of celebration for the founding of the United States. All families of all generations are together having a meal. We should be talking about climate change, and we should be talking about it honestly so that it is a common topic of conversation. We find in our polling that people generally don't talk about climate change. So we need to, first of all, ask young people to just talk to their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whomever about climate change. But then I think that as we move forward, we are going to have political activism to make sure that the leaders in charge are willing to make the changes, but they need the political will. They need to know that voters are behind them, that the people are behind them in order to make choices that, as you say, some people don't want. They don't want to change. The one place where I think change can happen very quickly is immediately after a very bad event, say a typhoon, or you've been having extreme heat waves or a drought. Generally, because of our cognitive biases, that is the way we view risk as humans, we tend to be very optimistic, think it won't affect us, and we don't need to change. But if we or someone close to us has suffered through one of these terrible events, there's often greater interest in making sure that it doesn't happen again, that there are better plans in place. And I think that you can have communities leading. Certainly in my understanding of India, there has been some wonderful work done on better planning for extreme heat events. Moving, for example, intensive care units from the top floor of a hospital to the bottom floor, or the maternity ward, so the kids, babies aren't as stressed by heat. And making changes that allow for more cooling to occur. So I think as we can find concrete things for people to do, perhaps that will feel like less of a change and more of just making things better. At least that's my hope. But first of all, we need to talk about it. That's the first step to gaining understanding and consensus on how to move forward.
Right, ma'am. Coming to how terrifying COVID-19 as a pandemic has been. So the very fact that it was so unpredictable and unimaginable is something that gives chills to people till date. And perhaps also makes us question the principle of resilience, that what are we actually building resilience for? Because we clearly have no idea of the danger that is there in future. For example, just how COVID-19 was so unpredictable. So in that kind of a scenario, how do you think we can convince people to be more resilient for in the present?
Well, there are two lessons from COVID-19 that I would take away. When I worked at the White House under President Obama, and before that at the Department of Homeland Security, which is our security agency born out of the terrorist attacks in 9/11, I worked on biological threats. And actually, pandemic was a very known threat. I even wrote editorials saying it's not a question of if, but when. When we talked about the Spanish flu that just crossed the entire earth in 1918. So plenty of experts knew that this was a risk. The problem was getting the political leaders to respond to it in the nature of the risk it was. And then, at least in the United States, we had failure of leadership. Our president and his administration did not take seriously the news that we were getting out of China as early as January 2nd. So we wasted time before we took action to prepare, which has meant that we are having just, and still, very serious spread of the disease within the United States. So the first lesson, it kind of goes back to our last question, listen to the experts. Treat them seriously when they say you've got to get ready. The second answer I would say is that the spread of the pandemic with climate change events still happening. So we're still having extreme heat events. We're still having wildfires in the United States. We're still having big storms. You've had two storms, one on your East Coast, one on your West Coast, in the midst of COVID, having to evacuate people, social distance under those circumstances. So the lesson from all of that happening at once is that we need to plan for nations, and subnational groups need to plan for compounding, cascading risks, threats that can happen all at once. COVID happening, plus a typhoon, plus an extreme heat event. And frankly, we've never really done that before, certainly not in the United States. Our planners had not contemplated, I'm confident in saying, an event that would take place across our entire country, that is the pandemic, plus then having the other extremes that we see on a more frequent basis like hurricanes and wildfires. So this has caused tremendous stress for our emergency managers. And so we need to learn to plan for multiple events, and we need to plan for all hazards. We can't just plan for pandemics, and we can't just plan for a flood. We need to take an all hazard look that picks up earthquakes, Those can be also very devastating. Tsunamis, other risks, and build a system that is resilient to all hazards. And then, of course, you'll need a little bit different supplies for a pandemic than you will for something else, and you'll need to think through that as a government. But we need to plan for all hazards. And that is the trend in emergency planning. So it's just a matter of changing, as you've said, and change can take a while.
Right. Ma'am, also when it comes to executing these plans, you once mentioned that after the Global Frameworks report came out, that that lawyers need to be active players in this scenario, that they need to take up cases and they need to pass, or judges need to pass more cases that have that involve the green law. However, ma'am, could you explain how you exactly saw that? What was the thought process behind making lawyers a big stakeholder in this entire scenario?
Well, under the legal system, you can have very dramatic changes occur very quickly. And in the United States, we've seen that with civil rights laws regarding discrimination against certain groups for the color of their skin, for their sex, their sexual orientation, variety of things. So once the Supreme Court, our top court in the United States, rules, that can change things very quickly. You also have seen that through our liability system, that's where somebody gets injured and then they sue, they bring a lawsuit against whoever injured them seeking money. So under that liability scheme, you can also see that it can bring change because, for example, smoking we know harms people, and through the tobacco litigation against the tobacco companies, eventually the level of smoking has greatly diminished within the United States. So the law can be a lever for change, but it doesn't always act as a lever. So there's a question mark about it. Will it actually be able to do what I certainly hope it would do, which is bring about rapid change? We have a number of cases right now across the United States, really, against the fossil fuel companies. So Exxon, Shell, the BP, the big fossil fuel producers. And those cases have alleged a variety of things, but including that they knew that carbon emissions would be harmful, and they went ahead and sold their product, and that has caused a great deal of harm, and now that should be addressed. Initially, those cases were being dismissed by most courts at the lower levels, but increasingly they're finding their way through different, and the court system works with lots of cases going across the different courts at once. And we're seeing that those cases have continued to go through the courts. So there may be some relief in the future or change in the future as a result of that litigation. So that's why we included that in our book, because the law could bring change quickly. We just don't know if and when it will do that yet.
So along this legal tangent itself, and something that might not be related to climate change itself, but I'll use it as an example from your answer, which is to say that something that we're seeing growing across the global judicialization, which means the growth of judicial power that sort of undermines the democracies that we have set up in different countries, right? Which means a lot of judiciary is now taking it up to themselves to legislate over just make judgments across about a particular case. So do you think that while the law could be used in order to frame good policies about climate change, etc., do you think it could also be to some extent judicial overreach to see that legislation coming out of a judiciary, which is not a direct democracy at least?
Well, of course, in the United States, we have three branches of government. We have the executive branch, which is the president, and then we have the legislative branch, which is our Congress, and then we have the judicial branch. And each are supposed to be a check on the other so that nobody can use too much power. And we're having a politicization of our judiciary in recent years in the United States. So that may go to your concern about the judiciary getting out of line. But I have to tell you that when I was a judge, two things. The first thing is that I would notice that when people became judges, and in the United States, we all wear these big black robes. When they wore the big black robes, you couldn't sometimes tell what their political objective was. So it became less politicized, in my opinion, as they began to hear cases. Not for everyone, but for many. And then in our federal system, the judges serve for life. So that may make them a little less sensitive to the politics. A state court judge, like I was in the state of California, I was elected. And then you really get some political maneuvering about decisions because the judge has to get reelected. And if the judge issues an unpopular but correct decision, the judge may no longer have a job. So it's a complex area, but frankly, I haven't seen the kind of, in climate, the kind of movement that you're suggesting. Mostly I've seen judges unwilling to rule on climate issues because they say, and we have many cases that say this, the judges say, this isn't a case, or this isn't an issue that a judge should decide. This is an issue the legislature needs to decide, or the president. It's too, because of just exactly what you said, it's too political. So that's what we've seen so far. But I know I have been recently studying your boundary water basin challenges in India. And I know that the Supreme Court has played a more active role than we typically say in our Supreme Court in resolving, and I'm not sure if I'll pronounce it right, but the Kaveri River and the dispute over allocations of water from that river. So that was interesting for me to see, that they had really become invested in what the outcomes were in a way that we don't normally see in the United States.
Right. And in conclusion, basically, so where are the university editorials? So what would your advice be to the student community to incorporate resilience in their lifestyle?
So first of all, talk about climate change. Second of all, if I were young, I would learn everything I could about climate change because I think there will be so many jobs, so many issues. When I started on climate change, I'd been a judge, a lawyer, but I didn't know anything about the science of climate change or really what it was about. But I was given this big task. I was told to figure out what the Department of Homeland Security should do about climate change and whether we should care about the impacts. And this was in 2009. As I went about learning about that and worked with people from our Navy, scientists across the federal government, I had what I call an aha moment where I just realized that this will affect everything. This will affect the legal system. It affects architecture, engineering. It affects our financial system, our public health. Really nothing is left untouched by the impacts of climate change. So if you're a young person, if you can learn more about climate change now and become more of an expert, you will have a skill that many people want because these impacts are occurring more frequently. They are bigger and they will continue to get bigger. And for those who understand what that means and what can be done about it, there'll be just lots of ways to be involved in very interesting work. One of the things that I love about working in climate change, even though it is a distressing issue, there's sadness about what the changes will bring, but I find that it excites me because unlike the law, no one can tell me, oh, we've done that. We already tried that. It doesn't work. In fact, everything, when you're deciding what to do about climate change, requires innovation. No one has done it before, as we talked. We're really at the beginning of this. So for those with ideas, energy, enthusiasm, and knowledge, I think there'll be tremendous opportunities. So my advice is get involved with climate change, and you will have a very rewarding career.
Right. And on this line of career in public policy, or how to get a little bit more politically involved, what would your advice be to aspiring students who want to take up a career in public policy? How do you think they should go about it? Because it's not a field that has a lot of job opportunities, for example, at least in India. So how would you suggest people go about pursuing a career in this and to get more politically involved about making change in the world?
Well, if you want to be a policymaker, one way to do is become politically involved, because then if your party is successful, you'll be able to probably obtain a job. The other way that I have seen is for people who want higher education to get a law degree. A law degree is certainly helpful in terms of understanding how laws get made, how they are applied, and that will make, I know it's improved my ability to contribute to policy making. I think a public policy school can also introduce you to concepts of public policy. One of the things that I have always followed is try to keep improving your skills. And to be a public policy maker, you need to not only understand how the policy will work, maybe understand the economics of it, maybe understand how it will be perceived by the community, how they will deal with it. But it also means that you're going to have to market it. And that means that you need to work on your public speaking skills as well as your written skills, so that you can communicate forcefully in a way that captures people's attention so that they want to learn more about the policies that you're working on and then do something with them. So I do advise all the young people with whom I work, if you don't like speaking in public, and we find many fear public speaking more than death, that you should go take a class or go practice. And similarly, practice your writing, because if you're an effective writer, you'll also be able to reach more people more quickly and efficiently. And that is part of policy. It's not that you just make the policy or write the paper. You actually have to market it and get people to want to adopt the policy and implement it.
Right. And I think with that, we'll come to the end of the interview. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute honor to have you here. And I think we've learned a lot across the duration of the conversation.